Yellow paint in video games. If you've clicked on this video, you probably already know what I'm talking about, which is simply that there has been this trend in recent years for a lot of video games to have this very obvious yellow paint, which is often placed on objects, whether that be ledges that you can interact with, crates that you can break, or whatever. They're just there to mark things to say, hey, you can interact with this thing. And it's not always yellow paint. Sometimes it's white. White is another one. And sometimes, it's not paint. Maybe it's like some cloth that's tied on it and flapping or whatever. But the point is that these are very obvious markers that you can interact with things. And it gets a lot of hate. It is something that people have turned against recently. And it's frequently criticized as being like lazy design or something along those lines. And I want to really push back against that and really sort of argue the opposite and kind of explain why and how it is that yellow paint is actually very good game design. So I'm going to go through a few reasons for why that is today. So the first one that I really want to go into is talking about shared design language. So when you talk about video games, most people, right, when they pick up a video game, they're not playing the very first video game they've ever played in their lives. They've probably played a few other video games before at a bare minimum. If it is, the very first video game they're ever playing, well, congratulations. They're probably having a hard time of it. They're probably, like 5 years old or whatever, right? But when you have, say, an adult who is playing a video game, who's played a bunch of other video games before, they are not typically really coming into it completely fresh, right? They may be obviously playing this video game for the first time, but they have played a lot of similar video games before. They've played other video games in the same genre or, something along those lines. And the reality is that video game design evolves and changes over time and builds upon existing standards of knowledge. So let's take, for example, League of Legends. So League of Legends is a MOBA. If you've played League of Legends, you know what that means. And League of Legends was based on an earlier game called Dota, which was itself a mod of Warcraft 3, and Warcraft 3 was a typical RTS game, real-time strategy game. Real-time strategy games are not as common, not as popular nowadays. The design evolved. Now we have a lot more MOBAs like League of Legends, and League of Legends is in many ways a sort of spiritual successor, a game that grew out of those RTS games. And so when you played League of Legends, when it first came out, so say, 10 years ago, you're playing League of Legends, you might have been somebody who had previously played, other games that it was based on, right? So you might have previously played Warcraft 3, and then because you were playing Warcraft 3, when you start playing League of Legends, you already have a lot of familiarity with the core game mechanics because you already understand them from having played Warcraft 3 previously. Now, of course, nowadays, you get somebody who maybe, plays League of Legends for the first time. They've never played, an RTS before. They've never played Warcraft 3. So maybe they have a harder time of learning it, a harder time of getting into it. But at the time, obviously, this was a natural outgrowth of an earlier sort of gameplay. And so, of course, the fact was that, you had an easier time getting into it specifically because it was based on a game that other people had already played and already knew. And likewise, design evolves and changes over time as, basically just video games evolve. So, at the time, it was a lot more common that you would make real-time strategy games. Now it's a lot more common that you would make MOBAs. And that's just because that genre has sort of emerged or evolved out of a prior genre, and it's a lot more popular nowadays. Likewise, particular design strategies, come and go, partly just depending on what is fashionable. So a really good example is actually Resident Evil 4. The original Resident Evil 4, right, had a lot of QuickTime events. So the whole concept of QuickTime events was that you would be watching cutscenes, and then in the middle of these cutscenes, which are normally just a static thing that you don't interact with, you might see, a button appear on screen, and then you need to press that button really quickly within a certain amount of time. Maybe you need to press a bunch of buttons, with a great amount of precision. Maybe there's a failure state if you press the wrong button, etc. But basically, if you press all these buttons in the right way, then the cutscene continues. And, if you don't, then there's some kind of failure state. And, of course, in Resident Evil 4, what that typically meant was that you just died instantly or something, right? So you're in this cutscene, and it's like, a guy, shoots a gun at you or something. And then it's like, okay, you got to press this button to, get out of the way. And, if you fail, then you die instantly. And if you succeed, then you narrowly dodge the bullet. And then the cutscene continues, right? And it's actually very funny because the remake of Resident Evil 4 just completely removed all that. Because obviously I think that, quick time events were actually kind of in fashion for a while. I want to say about 10, 15 years ago. They were somewhat fashionable. And a lot of video games had them, and then they became kind of overused, and people got a bit annoyed about them. And ultimately, at the end of the day, fell out of fashion, and nowadays almost no video games do it. So, of course, when they were making the remake for Resident Evil 4, they just took them out entirely. But that's actually quite funny, because there were actually a lot of cutscenes in the original Resident Evil 4 that were very clearly designed to feature a lot of these QuickTime events. And so there are cases in the new game where you can tell that it's like this cutscene like goes on weirdly long, and there's like a lot of like weird combat in it, and why did all that happen? And the answer is because in the original game you would have done some QuickTime events here, but now it's just kind of filler because they took that out, right? So gameplay language evolves over time as basically certain things fall into and out of fashion, and it is a good thing to follow those trends because again, when you are relying on things that people have played previously, it makes it easier for people to get into the game. So if I'm to put yellow paint into my video game now, because all these other video games have used yellow paint previously, that actually is a good thing, because it means that, the player sees that yellow paint, they're immediately like, okay, I know I've seen this in like 3 other games, and so of course, great, I know exactly what I need to do when I see the yellow paint, no problems. But at the same time, similar to the way that QuickTime events, eventually kind of became outdated, old-fashioned, and were no longer used in video games very much going forward, yes, we might, come a time where yellow paint fully falls out of fashion and, we do different stuff. That might be the case. The next thing I want to talk about is why yellow paint is good visual design. So when you're making a video game, you need to make contrasting elements that make it very clear what's actually going on in the video game, because otherwise players will have a very confusing experience. So let's take the original Resident Evil 4 and let's take the new Resident Evil 4. Let's compare them up against each other a little bit, and you can kind of see a little bit about what I am talking about. So in this scene that we have here in the original Resident Evil 4, you can tell the graphics are obviously not super modern. They're a little bit outdated by today's standards. And you can tell also that things are pretty simple. The environment is pretty simple. There's not a ton of stuff that you can obviously interact with. There's not a ton of models. It's very clearly just sort of like, okay, here's some ground. There's some trees in the background. There's this house to the side. There's this farmer here with the hay. And there's a little bit of wood on the side, and that's it. And of course, you've got your character Leon in the center. And notice that everything is brown. Everything is dark. Everything is shades of brown. Everything is roughly the same color. Really quick one. You can tell, he goes into combat. He pulls out his gun. Red dot laser sight. And that is very good visual design language because that stands out very clearly, very distinctly against this very brown environment, right? It's very bright, it's very red. That makes it very easy to tell, where exactly you're shooting and what exactly is happening with the action. That really strong contrast between that bright red and everything else in the game that's brown makes it very obvious what's going on. Now, at the same time, obviously that's based on reality, right? Like red dots on laser sights are red, right? That's normal. But, at the same time, it's really well done because they've obviously cranked that red up to be very bright and very obvious and so on. You can imagine, obviously, this would be a little bit unrealistic on its own, but let's imagine that actually in real life, laser sights are brown for some reason, right? Again, wouldn't really make sense because it's the exact same reason that they're red in real life is because it's very bright, makes it very easy to see what's going on. But let's imagine they're brown, and let's imagine that in this game you've got a brown laser sight, and it barely stands out against the brown environment. You can't tell at all what's going on, right? That would be terrible visual language. So having that really strong contrast between that bright red and everything else that's brown in the scene makes it very easy to tell what's going on, communicates that very easily. Okay, so next you go into this room, right? And again, things are very brown. Okay, whatever. You've got your red laser sight. Okay, great. However, there's something else that you will notice, which is that there are some things that stand out in this scene as being very different, and that is the box in the background, which is a bit whiter, the ladder, which you can climb, And then just those planks on the left side, which are, you can't really do anything with those, but they're a bit lighter as well. This, again, makes these objects stand out because they are much lighter than the surrounding environment. So that, generally makes it easy to immediately see those things and get a sense of, okay, maybe I can interact with those things. Maybe there's something that I can do here. And likewise, everything else in the scene is roughly still sort of drab and brown looking. And, it's not necessarily super interesting. Now, obviously, with those planks on the left, you can't actually interact with those planks on the left, so there's not really anything you can do there. But the contrast makes it very evident that there are things that you can do with the ladder and with that box in the background. And again, that's really good visual design language. Sometimes the contrast doesn't need to be super, super distinct to make it pretty obvious and to make it pop. So just making these things a bit lighter makes it very evident that these are interactable objects. Okay, so the next thing here is that an object has dropped from this enemy that you've killed, and there is this giant beam of light which appears above it. That giant beam of light is like, hey, there's an item here. You can interact with this. And also the color of that beam of light communicates to you what kind of object it is. Because there are a few different kinds of object in the game that you can collect, so they have different colors for the beams of light that appear around them. So that immediately says, hey, there's an item here, pick it up, that's important. And that's obviously a very, very obvious, a very good example of visual language. You put this really, really obvious marker that there's an item here. Likewise, you've got these barrels. They don't quite stand out as well in the scene, but from having interacted with a bunch of other barrels in the game that you can break these barrels, right? So you break these barrels, and again, you've got the giant beam of light on the items to tell you, hey, you can pick these items up. And another thing that is maybe a little bit subtle that you probably don't notice right away is that these items also shine. In addition to, obviously, the beam of light that appears over them, they also have this shimmer effect on them that makes it very evident, makes them stand out. Even if the beam of light was not there, you could easily tell, hey, there's an item here. And you can see that shine most obviously right here, where you open up this thing of drawers here, and then there's this gem here in the drawers, and it does this sparkly effect on it. And the same thing here with these coins. So you can see that in the scene there are a lot of very obvious markers, a lot of visual language communicating to you, hey, here's stuff that you can interact with. Here's all these bright, shiny markers saying, hey, interact with this thing. And I would like to point out that these are the exact same kinds of visual language that are, yellow paint. Like, this is just yellow paint from a different era. This is how you communicated to people, hey, there is stuff here you interact with. But for some reason, nobody's complaining about, hey, these giant unnatural beams of light. No one's saying, hey, these unnatural shiny effects on these objects. No one's complaining about those things. And that was just the visual language at the time. So let's compare this to the remake, right? So here is a similar scene from the remake. You're still in the village, but you can tell there's a lot more graphical fidelity here. The scene is a lot more complicated. And you can also tell there's a lot more light sources. There's a lot more objects in the scene. You've got all kinds of, boxes over here on the right. You've got some shelves with some books on them. You got a lantern. You got a pitchfork. You got these stairs going up. And you can see on the left side that there is a barrel there. But you can also see that it has yellow paint on it, signifying that it can be broken. Now, just looking at this scene, comparing the visual language to this game that we were just looking at, if I was to run into the scene and there was no yellow paint on that barrel, would I know exactly, where the items that I'm looking for are? Probably not. And that's just because there is a lot more stuff in this scene for your brain to visually process. And you can see also that these items have the same sort of similar effect with the, beam of light over them. But, they don't necessarily have quite that same shiny effect on them. Now you can see here, you run up the stairs. Obviously, there is a shotgun on the wall. There's not a ton of other stuff on the wall, which makes it pretty evident. It's also at the top of the stairs, which makes it easy to see. And then, of course, you can see here also that there is this smashable shelf area that you can then grab an item from. And likewise here, you have some yellow tape on this window that obviously says, hey, this window is interactable. You can smash this window. And again, would I have known that necessarily running into this house for the first time? Maybe, maybe not. It's less clear to me because there's just so much more stuff going on in the scene. And just a little personal complaint, I really like the red dot sight that was on all the guns back then, right? It's like, God, it's a little bit less, easy to really distinguish the action in this. Obviously, I understand that they, made the decision to kind of remove that, make the guns a little more, whatever. But, you can tell that the action it's a little bit more confused in terms of, just seeing exactly what you're doing. So based on that, right, you've got this game. It's got these, obvious, giant, beams on the items. Do you think that I would be able to find any of the items in this scene if they, didn't have these giant beams on them? No, of course not. They'd be virtually impossible to see. Just for example, this one guy died right here, and, he's got this beam, but I would not be able to have found that item because there's another guy running in right behind him, and he would have immediately visually covered up that item. I would not have been able to see it basically at all unless I walked directly up to it and happened to find it. And that's the thing, right? People like to complain about these sort of signposts in video games that tell you, hey, there's a thing here to interact with. But those exact same people, if you were to say, all right, great, we've got this setting in the video game, you can just turn all of those things off right now. If a lot of those people were to turn that off, they would immediately find that they get stuck all the time. They can't find items, they can't figure out which ledges they're supposed to jump to, and so on. And this is a large consequence of making video games more realistic. So going back to the original Resident Evil 4, again, part of the reason that this game, has very clear visual language is just because these environments are so simple. Compared to today's standards, they are not super complex. And there aren't a ton of objects in the scene to distract your eyes visually. When you're trying to find an item to interact with or an item that you can pick up, it's a lot easier because there's a lot less clutter that's getting in the way of your, visual processing. When I go to something like, the Resident Evil 4 remake, it's a lot more beautiful. Yes, it's a lot more realistic looking. Yes. But that also means that there's a lot more stuff on the screen to process, and that makes it a lot harder to immediately figure out, exactly what you're supposed to do. So you often need to have these very clear, very obvious, visual indicators to tell you, hey, you can interact with this thing, or else people will just completely miss them. And I cannot emphasize this enough. People always, pretend like, oh, I'm the person who wouldn't need that thing. I'm the person who doesn't like that thing, etc. But I can't tell you how many times, you take those kinds of people. If you were to take those exact people and you were to put them in a room where they're playtesting a new video game that you're making, we're like, hey, we need some playtesters, try this game out, see how you like it. They would, get stuck all the time. They'd be like, this is a crappy video game, whatever. And of course, people often make the complaint that, okay, well, it's a lazy solution. Obviously 3D environments are a little bit harder to guide players to do the right kinds of actions, but you should just be really good at level design to make up for that, right? The problem is, that basically your level designers suck, so they're using this yellow paint as a sort of cover-up, a band-aid, an easy way out, rather than just designing the levels better. And I cannot emphasize enough, that's really not true, because, basically that would massively constrain the kind of design decisions that you can make. So if you're saying, okay, you should just design the game so that the levels, make it very clear when there's a jumpable ledge, then basically the only way that you can do that is to make a series of, blank empty hallways with a ledge at the end. Or, basically like stretches where you can't interact with anything with a ledge at the end to make it very clear to you, hey, you're supposed to jump to this ledge. That's basically the only way that you could design around that, because if you try to introduce, basically any larger amount of visual complexity, if you try to introduce, more stuff that you can interact with all in that scene, then what's going to happen is, basically people are going to get confused and they're going to get stuck. And the reality is that you don't want to get stuck. A player who gets stuck in a action-focused video game where you're supposed to be just constantly moving forward, constantly, shooting enemies, picking up items, moving forward, etc., that's the worst sin you can commit. Because the instant that you spend more than like a minute getting stuck trying to do something, that's when the person is just like, oh god, I hate this game, what's going on, I want to quit. That's the unfortunate reality. People's attention spans are great so long as they are actively engaged and being led through things to do. But the instant that they get really stuck on something, it could be a minute, it could be 2 minutes, doesn't have to be very long at all. That's the point where they're going to be like, screw this game, I don't enjoy this anymore. I cannot emphasize enough, it happens all the time. So because you need to structure the game in such a way that players are constantly led through things that they can do and don't really run into any major roadblocks, you have to put these very obvious, very clear signposts in. And you can say also, well, the yellow, it breaks the immersion. It breaks my immersion to see, this very obvious signpost that I'm supposed to interact with this thing. Well, great, that's the frickin' point. The yellow paint is supposed to be immersion breaking. It is supposed to stand out. It is supposed to be very clear visual language. Hey, you can interact with this. Because if you make it, something that blends in more, if you make it brown, again, to go back to my earlier example, it's just going to blend in with the environment and nobody's going to pay attention. It's not going to do anything. And I can't emphasize enough, I myself had this exact experience playing through the Resident Evil 4 remake. So in fact, there is a level later on towards the end of the game where you're in a cave. The cave is lit. It's pretty yellow. They just had to do that because that is, the makeup, that's the nature of lighting a cave with yellow light. And it's kind of brown and yellow. And it's kind of like, all right, well, everything's kind of yellow. And I could not find the exit. I could not find the ledge I was supposed to climb, even though there was yellow paint on it, because the yellow blended in with everything else. And I'll give you this exact gameplay right now. So here you can see Leon is in this cave. It's, sort of dimly lit, yellow light, yellow and brown, etc. You've just done a bunch of stuff. You have to run around. You have to come up here. Okay, whatever. There's some stuff up here. And, behind you, there's this ledge that you were supposed to climb. And, of course, we've got some white cloth on it with some yellow paint. I can't emphasize enough, when I got to this part of this game, I got confused and I ran around in this cave in circles for a while because I really wasn't reading my mini-map too closely. And I went oh god, where was I supposed to go? And I thought maybe I wasn't supposed to go through this cave. So I ended up going back through, some prior stuff, back into the earlier parts of the level and going okay, was there another door over here I missed? I looked around for a while, didn't find anything. Went, what the hell is going on? This is the point where I was all right, maybe I need to look up a guide. I don't want to do that because I would like to just, play this freaking game without having my immersion broken. Your immersion is broken a lot more by getting stuck and needing to look up a guide to figure out what to do next than it is by seeing a bit of yellow paint in the game. I can assure you that much. But again, I didn't see the yellow paint. I ran around for a while, couldn't find it. Eventually I found it. Eventually I found this exact ledge, and then I went, oh, this is what I was missing. And, great. I was able to get out of the cave, move on to the next area. Great, go fight the last boss, beat the game, etc. And you can tell me, hey, I'm a shitty gamer or whatever. Fine. I make video games for a living. I play a lot of video games. Say what you want, man. It is what it is. But the reality is that basically everyone needs these signposts. Everyone needs these very obvious, everyone needs this very obvious yellow paint, or else they don't make it through the game. That is the reality. It being immersion breaking is supposed to be the point. If you didn't have something that was immersion breaking, you wouldn't pay attention to it. People just don't pay attention to crap all the time. And so making it stick out like that is a good thing, because it communicates very solidly, very clearly to the player, and it's very hard to miss. You can still miss it, as in this example from me, and that can create a bad experience, but creates a much better experience 99% of the time, because then the player immediately knows where to go, what to do next, and so on. And so I'll be quite honest, I think yellow paint is a really ingenious solution. It's a really good design language. It works really well, and just for some reason, a lot of people hate it. And I think also that I should point out that it's just kind of the consequence of the trend towards realism in 3D games. The way that I was talking earlier about how, just design, trends change over time, and yellow paint became a trend. And, it used to be that, like, QuickTime events were a trend, and then, we used to have a lot more RTS games, and then they kind of got superseded or, replaced by MOBAs. People's tastes change. And I think that the big thing that's happened is that there became this trend for 3D games to be more realistic. When you make 3D games that are more realistic, then you lost something. There was something very simple and very clear about the visual design, the visual language of earlier 3D games. When you look at something like Super Mario 64, obviously very primitive graphics, low poly, etc., but because it was so low poly, they were not afraid to do things like just be like, all right, here's some boxes floating in the sky. You can platform by jumping from this box to that box, right? And that made it very evident, like, okay, that other box floating in the sky is the only place I can go. It creates this sort of fantasy, unnatural irreality to the whole situation, because obviously it doesn't make sense that boxes are just floating in the sky. But, as we get more and more into, games needing to be super realistic, we put this emphasis on making ultra-realistic environments. The ultra-realistic environments have to be filled with all kinds of clutter, which makes it hard to communicate clearly things. And so you have to come up with these workarounds. You have to come up with these design language ways to communicate that, hey, don't pay attention to the clutter over there. You need to pay attention to the thing that you can interact with over here. And that's difficult. And I think that ultimately, personally, what I would like is if video games just stop trying to be so realistic. I'll be quite honest. If you just let video games kind of be fun with it, kind of be a little weird with it, and just kind of go back to an era where, we didn't have to have, super, super great graphics. Like, you can just be like, all right, like, like the graphics are fine, but like, you can have like empty hallways with nothing in them so that it's very easy to find things, right? You can make it so that it's like, all right, like, you have things that stand out very evidently against the background because there's not much else going on. I would love for video games to be able to do that again, but ultimately I think that's not really what the market wants right now. It's not really the way that the trend has gone. And so the at the end of the day, the result is that we're stuck with the yellow paint. This is where we're at. Either we can completely change the way that people tend to design and, just completely change the whole market and accept that that's going to mean things are a bit different, or we're going to have to accept that yellow paint is here to stay. Yellow paint's a great solution. It does what it needs to do. And obviously some people on the internet are going to complain about it, but for every one person that complains about yellow paint, there are 99 people who A, don't care, and B, their enjoyment of a video game is immensely 10x improved by yellow paint, and they just don't think about it or don't really acknowledge it or aren't really aware of it. That is the reality of the situation. So that is all for this week's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash that notification bell. Comment down below to let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Generate all your yellow paint hater comments down there. Tell me I suck crap. Whatever it is you like to do on YouTube videos. I will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.